The glass shattered against the marble floor, a heartbeat before Juliette Marwood realized she was going to die. She stood in the center of the grand obsidian hall, the most forbidden chamber in all of Mordaine Court, with the shards of a centuries-old enchantment vessel dissolving like black smoke around her feet. And every vampire in the room had gone absolutely, terrifyingly still. 100 pairs of ancient eyes fixed on her. 100 immortal predators. Each older than any nation she had ever learned about in school. Each more powerful than anything her human mind could properly comprehend. And every single one of them looked as though they wanted her blood on the floor beside the broken glass. She had not meant to break it. That was the honest truth, and she clung to it the way a drowning person clings to driftwood, because the truth was all she had left. 3 minutes ago, she had been doing her job. She had been carrying a tray of ceremonial goblets through the hall the way she did every Saturday night, weaving between the silk-draped tables, keeping her eyes down, keeping her breathing even, keeping herself invisible the way every human servant at Mordaine Court had learned to do if they wanted to survive the week. She had been ignoring the whispers, because there were always whispers when she walked through a room full of vampires. She had grown expert at ignoring them. 3 years of service had taught her that the human, the little waitress, the mortal pet, why does Lord Mordaine keep that creature in his hall? She smells of daylight and weakness. She has no place here. And then the silver-haired vampire named Cassius Vale, who sat at the high table with his silver rings and his ancient contempt, had deliberately extended his boot into her path. She had gone down hard. The tray had gone flying. And among the goblets, unbeknownst to her, someone had placed a vessel she should never have been carrying. A vessel of black glass, etched with runes older than the city above them, sealed with wax the color of dried blood. It had struck the marble floor at precisely the right angle, and something inside the room had changed in a single catastrophic instant. The black smoke had erupted upward from the broken vessel in a column that hit the vaulted ceiling and spread. And from somewhere deep beneath the hall, from somewhere that Juliette felt in her sternum rather than heard with her ears, came a sound like the snapping of a chain that had been pulled taut for a very, very long time. And then the doors at the far end of the hall, the doors that had been sealed for 3 years, the doors that every member of Mordaine Court had learned not to look directly, swung open, and Sorin Mordaine walked out. He was the most beautiful and the most dangerous thing Juliette had ever seen, and she had seen a great many dangerous things in 3 years of serving vampires. He was tall, broad-shouldered, impossibly still in the way that only very old vampires were still, as though stillness was something they had mastered so completely it had become a kind of presence all its own. His skin was white as winter moonlight. His hair the color of fresh snow falling over dark water, falling past his jaw in loose waves that somehow looked both ancient and achingly human. His eyes, when they found her across the length of the hall, were the deep red of a dying star, and they were the most alert, aware, and burning eyes she had ever seen on any creature alive or otherwise. He was dressed simply, or rather, he was dressed in clothes that had been simple once, before 3 years of isolation had worn them into something that looked like the aftermath of a war. A dark coat, a white shirt gone grey at the collar. He looked like a man who had been locked inside his own mind for a very long time and had only just been allowed to leave. He looked at her, and he did not look at anything else. The hall remained frozen. Juliette, still kneeling on the floor amid the ruins of the tray and the shattered vessel, slowly became aware that every instinct she possessed was telling her to run. She had learned in 3 years to argue with her instincts when the situation required it. She stayed still. Sorin Mordaine crossed the hall in silence. He moved the way a storm moves, purposeful and inevitable, and the crowd of ancient vampires parted for him without a sound, without a word, without a single creature daring to step into his path. He stopped in front of her, and he looked down at her, and the expression on his face was something she did not have a name for yet, though she would spend a considerable amount of time in the weeks ahead trying to find one. "You broke it," he said. His voice was low, precise, and carried the faint, beautiful accent of an older language than any she spoke. It was not an accusation. It was closer to wonder. "I tripped," she said, because it was the truth, and she had nothing better to offer. Something moved through his expression then, something that might have been in any other circumstance. A smile, he reached down and offered her his hand. Every vampire in the hall made a sound. Not a loud sound, not a collective gasp the way a human crowd would produce. It was something more discreet and more devastating than that. It was the sound of 100 immortals, recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Juliette Marwood looked at the hand of Sorin Mordaine, lord of the court, the vampire who had been sealed behind enchanted doors for 3 years by means she did not yet understand, and she took it. She had no idea, in that moment, what she had just set in motion. She had no idea what breaking that vessel truly meant, or what it would cost her, or how completely it would change every single thing about the life she had been living. She only knew that his hand was cool and steady and strong, and that when he helped her to her feet, he did not let go. Juliette had come to Mordaine Court the way most human servants did, through a combination of desperation and a particular kind of bravery that people who were comfortable sometimes mistook for recklessness. She had been 23, her savings spent, her options narrowed to almost nothing after the clinic she had been working at closed its doors. A woman she had known only slightly had mentioned, in the careful, indirect language that people used when discussing vampire courts, that there was work available in the underground halls of the Mordaine estate and that the pay was extraordinary. The Mordaine estate occupied 6 floors of what appeared, from the street, to be an abandoned Gothic revival building in the oldest part of the city. The floors above ground were genuinely empty, the floors below were not. There were 8 levels of chambers, galleries, ballrooms, libraries, and corridors carved from the bedrock itself, lit by enchanted lanterns that produced a cool, steady light but no warmth, decorated with centuries of accumulated art and influence, and populated by a vampire court that considered itself the oldest and most formidable in the northeastern quarter of the world. They had not been wrong about that, from what Juliette had observed. She had been hired as a server, specifically because she was human and because certain ceremonies at Mordaine Court required the presence of human staff. She had quickly distinguished herself by being, above all else, afraid. Not fearless in the stupid sense. She was not without survival instincts or self-preservation. She was simply someone who had decided, with clear eyes and a steady heart, that fear was not going to be the thing that ran her life. She had made that decision at 16, after a childhood that had given her every reason to let fear win, and she had not reversed it since. The vampires at Mordaine Court had hated her for it almost immediately. They were creatures of hierarchy, of status, of the ancient and complex social order that had governed their kind for millennia. In that order, humans occupied a specific and humble position. They were permitted to be useful. They were permitted to be servile. They were permitted, in certain courts, to be charming in the way that small decorative animals were charming. They were absolutely not permitted to look a vampire in the eye without invitation, to speak without being addressed, or to carry themselves as though they believed their own dignity was worth preserving. Juliette did all 3 constantly, and the fact that she did it quietly, without aggression, without any apparent attempt to provoke, made it somehow worse in the eyes of the court. She was not defiant, she was simply herself, and somehow that refusal to diminish herself was more offensive to certain ancient sensibilities than open rebellion would have been. Cassius Vale, in particular, had made her life difficult. He was old, cold, politically ambitious, and deeply committed to the idea that the natural order of things placed him far above any human currently breathing. He had tripped her twice before tonight. He had knocked her tray from her hands on 4 separate occasions. He had addressed her directly only once, to inform her, with a smile that showed every one of his teeth, that she smelled like something that ought to be kept outdoors. She had smiled back, said, "Thank you so much," in the flattest possible tone, and walked away. It had, if anything, made him angrier. She had survived 3 years at Mordaine Court by being competent, observant, and impossible to break. She had learned the rhythms of the court, the names and ranks and ancient grievances of its inhabitants, the political fault lines and alliances and blood feuds that governed every ceremony and every dinner table seating arrangement. She had learned things that, strictly speaking, human servants were not supposed to know, because she was the kind of person who noticed things and remembered them. One of the things she had noticed was the doors. They were at the far end of the grand obsidian hall, past the high table, past the great fireplace that burned with blue flame, past the portrait gallery that lined the eastern wall. Tall doors of black iron, carved with the Mordaine crest. They had been sealed when she arrived 3 years ago. No one explained why. No one looked at them. When she had asked, carefully and indirectly, the other human servants had gone pale and changed the subject, and a vampire of middling rank named Ileana had told her, with a kind of bored menace, that it was the sort of question that could get a person quietly and permanently removed from the premises. She had stopped asking. But she had kept noticing. The court was run, in the 3 years of the doors being sealed, by a council of senior vampires. Cassius Vale sat at its head. The court functioned as far as anyone could observe, but there was a quality to it that Juliette had come to think of privately as a borrowed quality, as though everything was being maintained in trust and for something that was meant to return. The older vampires, the ones who had been at Mordaine Court for centuries, moved through their days with a particular kind of waiting in their posture. The newer ones, the politically ambitious ones, the ones who had attached themselves to Cassius and his faction, moved through their days with a different quality entirely. A quality that Juliette had eventually identified as something between relief and greed. Now she understood what she had been watching for 3 years. Sorin Mordaine had been sealed behind those doors by an enchantment. Someone had imprisoned him. And the vessel that Cassius Vale had deliberately placed in her path, which he had expected would be knocked and possibly broken by her fall, but not opened, not shattered, not destroyed utterly the way it had been destroyed, had been the anchor of that enchantment. She understood all of this. Working backward from Cassius Vale's expression, in the 2 minutes after Sorin took her hand and helped her to her feet, Cassius Vale's face had gone the color of old bone. He was not looking at her with contempt anymore. He was looking at her with something much more interesting and much more dangerous than contempt. He was looking at her with a terror so carefully controlled that only someone who had spent 3 years studying vampire expressions could have identified it. She filed that away. Sorin had not released her hand. He stood beside her now, facing the room, and the room faced him back, and the quality of the silence was something Juliette had never experienced before, not in 3 years of tense vampire court gatherings. It was a silence that contained 3 years of suppressed power returning to its source, and the weight of it pressed against her eardrums like depth pressure.
"Lord Mordaine,"
said Cassius Vale, and his voice was so admirably composed that Juliette almost appreciated the effort. "We are relieved to see you restored to us." Sorin looked at him for a long, long moment. "Are you?" he said. It was not a question. "The circumstances." Cassius began, and Sorin lifted one hand in a gesture so slight and so absolute that every sound in the room ceased, including Cassius's voice. "Not yet," Sorin said. He looked at Juliette. "Is there somewhere more private?" She blinked. Of all the things she had anticipated him saying, that had not been among them. "There is a service corridor behind the East Gallery," she said. "The court does not use it." "Show me," he said. She showed him. The service corridor was narrow and plain, running behind the decorated walls of the gallery, accessible through a door that looked like paneling from the hall side. She used it every night to move between stations without crossing the main floor. It smelled of stone and the faint wax of the lanterns, and it was the most human-scaled space in the entire building. Sorin stood in it and looked around with an expression she could not categorize. And then he sat down on the stone floor with his back against the wall, because there was no furniture, and put his head back and breathed. Juliette leaned against the opposite wall and watched him. After a moment, he said, without opening his eyes, "You are not afraid of me." "I am a little afraid of you," she said honestly, "but not in a way that's going to make me useless." He opened his eyes at that. The red of them was extraordinary up close, ancient and burning, and more alert than anything she had encountered. 3 years, he said. "I know," she said. "I have been here all 3 of them." "You have been here," he said, as though placing that fact carefully. "Tell me what I missed." And she told him. She had spent 3 years noticing and remembering, and she gave him all of it, organized and clear, the way she organized everything, the political realignments, the alliances Cassius had built, the vampires who had left, and the ones who had arrived, the financial arrangements she had overheard, the blood laws that had been quietly amended and the ones that had been quietly ignored. She told him about the outer court, the contacts and representatives who came to the quarterly gatherings and seemed increasingly uneasy. She told him, calmly and precisely, what 3 years of Cassius Vale's stewardship had looked like from the ground floor. When she finished, Sorin was looking at her with an expression she had no name for again. "Who are you?" she said. "Juliette Marwood," she said. "I am a waitress." "You are a great deal more than that," he said. "I am also that," she said. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to catalogue the almost smiles. She had a feeling they were rare, and that recognizing them was a form of privilege she had not yet fully earned, and was being granted anyway. "They will move quickly," he said. "Cassius and his faction. They will know that I know. They have had 3 years to prepare for my return, and they will have a plan." "They will," she agreed. "They have also had 3 years during which I have been invisible to them, which means they have said a great many things in my presence that they would not have said in yours." The pause that followed that statement had a quality of very focused attention. "Tell me," he said. So she told him that too. The enchantment that had sealed Sorin Mordaine behind the iron doors had not been simple. The mechanics of it, which she had pieced together from overheard fragments over 3 years, required a sealed vessel as its anchor, a living blood oath sworn by a minimum of 3 vampires of sufficient age, and the cooperation of a specific kind of influence, which was to say that it required everyone who knew what had happened to agree, through their silence, to let it continue. The blood oath had been sworn by Cassius and 2 others she had identified. Their names were Ruxan and Mira, and they were old, and they were careful, and they were Cassius's closest allies on the council. The vessel she had shattered had been their anchor. Without it, the enchantment had no foundation. The oath still existed, but an oath without an anchor was a chain without a lock, and Sorin, as the court's rightful lord, carried within his blood a claim to the Mordaine seat that was itself older and more fundamental than any oath 3 vampires could swear against it. He was free, but they were not yet safe, and there was a difference. She told him this, and he listened to every word, and when she finished, he said, "You have been protecting my court." "I have been doing my job," she said. "My job happens to include keeping a record of things." "Why?" he said. "You owe this court nothing. They have treated you with contempt." She considered that. "Because," she said after a moment, "something was wrong, and I was here, and I noticed things." He looked at her for a long time with those burning red eyes and said nothing, and she had the distinct sense that he was doing something with his silence that she did not fully understand, something internal and ancient, a kind of reckoning. "I need to return to the hall," he said finally. "Tonight?" "Yes," she said. "They will expect you to be disoriented, to need time. That expectation is your advantage. Do not give them time to use it." He stood from the floor in a single fluid motion that reminded her, with great clarity, that whatever was happening between them in this narrow corridor was still happening in the presence of something profoundly not human, something old and dangerous and governed by its own ancient codes. He was looking at her as though she had reminded him of that too. "Stay close to me tonight," he said. "Not because you are in danger," he added, before she could respond, "though you may be, but because I find that I am better informed with you near me." She nodded. She could work with that. They walked back into the hall together. What followed was 3 hours of the most extraordinary political theatre Juliette had ever witnessed, and she had witnessed quite a lot in 3 years. Sorin Mordaine, who had been imprisoned for 3 years and who had had approximately 40 minutes in a service corridor to reorient himself, systematically and with complete composure, dismantled every structural advantage that Cassius Vale had built in his absence. He did it through the blood laws. Ancient vampire courts operated on a code of laws that was older than most countries. These laws governed succession, alliance, punishment, and the fundamental rights of court members. Cassius had bent several of these laws and broken others, quietly, incrementally, in ways that were defensible if viewed individually but constituted, in aggregate, a serious violation of the code. Sorin named each one. He did it in front of the full court. He did it without raising his voice, and the lack of raised voice was itself a demonstration of power so complete that even Juliette, who did not share the instinctive response that every vampire in the room was clearly having, felt its weight. Cassius tried to speak twice. The second time, a vampire who had been at Mordaine court for 600 years, and whose opinion Cassius had previously relied on as a kind of social anchor, quietly and deliberately moved from one side of the room to the other. It was the most elegant thing Juliette had ever seen. The two others who had sworn the blood oath, Ruxin and Mira, moved to stand with Cassius, and then stopped moving, because they understood in that moment, in the way that very old creatures understand inevitable things, that the number of vampires in the room who were prepared to stand with Cassius and the number who were not had stopped being equal a long time ago, and that the enchantment had been the only thing making it look otherwise. The blood oath was formally dissolved an half-hour before dawn, in a ceremony that involved all three oath-bearers acknowledging before the full court that the oath had been sworn in violation of the Mordaine succession code, which made it void under blood law. This was done in the specific ceremonial language that bound such things in the court's memory and made them part of the record that could not be unmade. Cassius Vale looked at Juliette once, during that ceremony, with an expression so cold and so specific that she filed it carefully, and did not let it show on her face. She stood near the edge of the room, as she always did. No one addressed her, no one acknowledged her. She was, once again, the waitress, the human servant, invisible and inconsequential. Except that across the room at the precise moment when the final words of the dissolution were spoken, Sorin Mordaine's eyes found hers, and he held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds, which was long enough to mean something and short enough to be deniable. She understood the message. She went back to her quarters, locked her door, and did not sleep. The weeks that followed were not easy. Cassius Vale and his closest allies had not been expelled from the court. Blood law made that complicated, because expulsion required a specific form of formal violation, and while what they had done constituted a betrayal of the succession code, formal expulsion required either a confession of specific treasonous intent or a court vote of sufficient majority. The court vote was close but not sufficient. Cassius still had allies who owed him debts, or feared him, or simply had not yet decided which side of history to stand on. So he remained, and he was quiet, and his quietness was the most dangerous thing about him. Juliette continued to work her shifts. She served at the dinners, she moved through the halls with the same invisible competence she had always carried. She recorded things, she noticed things, and increasingly, she was summoned to a different kind of appointment at the end of the evening, after the formal gatherings wound down and the court dispersed. Sorin's private library was on the 3rd sublevel, a room she had known existed but never entered. He worked there in the hours before dawn, reviewing the documents and records of 3 years of Cassius's stewardship, rebuilding a picture of his court. He had asked her, once formally, through a vampiric attendant with an expressionless face, whether she would be willing to assist in this process. She had said yes. She had said yes because she wanted to help. She recognized this was not the most professional justification, but it was the honest one. The library was extraordinary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of documents and books spanning centuries, lit by the same cool enchanted lanterns that lit the rest of the court, with a long table at its center that Sorin used as a working surface. He did not require much space. He was organized, focused, and moved through documents with the speed of someone for whom reading was not a sequential process, but something closer to absorption. She sat across from him and answered his questions, and occasionally asked her own. And the conversations that grew up around the work were the most interesting conversations she had ever had with anyone. He was not what she had expected, though she was not entirely sure what she had expected. He was old. Genuinely old in a way that made most of the vampires she had encountered seem recent, but he wore it differently than she would have anticipated. He was not nostalgic. He was not dismissive of the present. He paid attention with a quality of complete engagement that she associated more with very young minds than very old ones, and she had a sense, growing slowly, that this was a deliberate choice, that he had decided at some ancient juncture to remain genuinely curious about the world rather than sealed inside the amber of his own long history. He asked her about herself. Not in the way the court asked about things, with the particular combination of condescension and transactional assessment that characterized most vampire interest in human servants. He asked the way someone asks who is genuinely interested in the answer. She told him about her childhood, carefully at first, and then with more ease than she had expected. She told him about the decision she had made at 16. She told him about the clinic and the savings, and the choice that had brought her underground. He listened without interrupting, which was something fewer people could do than she would have liked. He told her, in return, about the court in its better centuries, about what it had looked like before the politics of the last 100 years had introduced the kind of ambition that produced people like Cassius. He told her about the old blood laws and why they had been written, and the logic of them, which was not the logic of cruelty, but the logic of a very old civilization trying to survive in a world that did not always acknowledge its existence. She told him she understood survival logic better than most. He looked at her with those red eyes and said, "Yes, I believe you do." The night that Cassius made his move, she was in the library. It was 3 weeks after the dissolution ceremony, and she had stayed later than usual because they had been in the middle of something, a discussion about a specific financial arrangement that Cassius had established with an outside party, an arrangement that looked like a trade agreement, but which she had suspected, based on 3 years of observation, was something more significant. Sorin had agreed with her reading, and they had been working backward through the documents to find the original terms. She heard the sound in the corridor first. A particular sound. The sound of footsteps moving with the specific non-sound that vampires produced when they were trying to be quiet, but were moving fast enough that some displacement of air was inevitable. She had learned to hear it, she said. Someone is coming and trying not to be heard, and Sorin was on his feet before she finished the sentence. 3 of them came through the door, not Cassius. He had learned, apparently, to send others first. She recognized 2 of them as members of his outer circle, vampires of significant age and ability. The third was Roxanne, the oath-bearer, who looked at Juliette with an expression of such specific and personal hatred that she understood, with absolute clarity, that this was partly about her. She had been the one to shatter the vessel. She had been the one who had become, in the weeks since, visibly significant to Sorin. In the political calculus of the court, those 2 things combined made her a target. Sorin stepped in front of her. He did not do it the way someone does when they are reacting to a threat and prioritizing protection out of instinct. He did it with deliberation, placing himself between her and the 3 vampires, with a completeness of intention that communicated without any words that anyone who wanted to reach her would have to go through him first, and that this would not be a quick or clean process for anyone involved. Roxanne, he said, with the particular quality of calm that she was beginning to understand, was not calmness at all, but something older and more dangerous masquerading as calm. You dissolved your oath. That gives you no further standing in this court. You are here illegally under blood law. The blood law you rely on, said Roxanne, is a law that you have to survive to enforce. Then it is fortunate, Sorin said, that I am very difficult to kill. What happened next was fast. Too fast for her to track with complete clarity, though she tracked more of it than she expected. Sorin moved and the room moved with him, and the 3 vampires who had come to kill him discovered in the following 90 seconds exactly how significant the gap was between their power and his, even after 3 years of imprisonment, even in a small library room with a table in the way. Roxanne ran. The other 2 did not run, but they were not capable of it by the time Sorin was finished with them. And she did not ask about their condition in detail, because the blood law governing prisoner treatment was something she was still learning. Sorin turned to her. He was breathing harder than usual, which for him meant he was breathing at all, and his white hair had come loose from whatever it had been held by and fell around his face, and he looked at her with an expression of sharp focus. "Are you injured?" he said. "You were in front of me the entire time," she said. "I am not injured." "Good," he said, and then something in his emotions shifted, and he said, quieter, "Stay here," and left. She stayed. She sat at the library table and she thought carefully and methodically about everything she knew. And then she stopped thinking and allowed herself, for approximately 4 minutes, to feel the specific and inconvenient truth that had been growing in her for 3 weeks. She felt it, acknowledged it, and then put it in its proper place and waited. He returned in 40 minutes. He sat down across from her, which was where he always sat, and looked at the documents on the table between them. Cassius will face formal charges tomorrow, he said. Conspiracy to violate blood law, 2nd count of betrayal against a sitting lord, and coordination with an outside party against the court. The documentation you helped me build was sufficient. Good, she said. He was looking at her. She looked back. You are not going to tell me that you were frightened, he said. I was frightened, she said. I am telling you now. Another almost smile. A different quality to this one. I should have moved you to safer quarters weeks ago, he said. I was aware of the risk, and I allowed the work to take priority. That was my error. It was also my choice, she said. I chose to stay and keep working. You should not have had to make that choice, he said. The responsibility for your safety in this court is mine. There was something in the way he said that which had nothing to do with court hierarchy or lord-to-servant obligations, and they both knew it. Sorin, she said. The name, without his title, without his formal designation. She had not used it before. It sat in the air between them like a door opening. He went very still in the way that vampires went still. Not human stillness, but something more absolute. That is the first time you have used my name, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, Juliette, and the way he said it, with that particular quality of his voice and that particular precision, made it feel like something else entirely. I need to tell you something, she said. Tell me. I did not break the vessel by accident, she said. Not entirely. She watched the meaning of this land. She watched him process it. She had the sense of very old and very precise machinery engaging. Explain, he said. Cassius put the vessel in my path deliberately, she said. He wanted it jostled. He wanted it damaged. I think his intention was to weaken the enchantment slightly, in a controlled way, possibly to check on your condition without fully releasing you. He had done something similar before, twice, with other vessels. I had noticed this. I had thought about what the vessels might be. She paused. He was watching her with complete and burning attention. When he tripped me, she said, I had a choice, in the moment of falling, about exactly how I fell. I chose the angle that would break the vessel completely rather than crack it. The silence that followed was absolute. You knew what you were doing, he said. I suspected, she said. I was not certain. I did not know who was behind those doors, or what they had been doing for 3 years, or whether releasing them would be good or catastrophic. I made a judgment based on 3 years of evidence that whatever Cassius was keeping behind those doors was more dangerous to him than to the court. You could have been wrong, he said. Yes, she said. I weighed that. He looked at her. She looked back. Why? He said. She thought about deflecting. She thought about professional distance and the logical reasons and the political calculus. And then she looked at his face and decided that she was done with deflection as a strategy. Because I had been watching this court for 3 years, she said. And everything that was wrong with it had the same source. And I am not someone who stands by when I can see how to fix something, even if fixing it is frightening. That is the reason of someone with a very particular kind of courage, he said. I know my own courage, she said. It is the thing I am most certain of. He stood from the table. He came around it. He was standing close to her now, close enough that she had to angle her head up to keep his eyes, and the red of them was warm in a way she had not expected warmth to look. You gave me back my court, he said. You gave me back 3 years. You protected what was mine when you owed it nothing, and then you freed me when you did not know if I was worth freeing, and you did it because you saw a wrong you could right. You make it sound very heroic, she said. I was also on the floor at the time. You were on the floor, he said, and you were still making a precise calculation about physics and enchantment vessels. She almost laughed. The situation was extraordinary enough that almost laughing felt appropriate. Juliette, he said, and she was learning to hear the specific frequency of her name in his voice, the way it was different from any other word he said. I want to tell you something. Tell me. I have been alive for a very long time, he said. I have had a great many experiences in that time. I have met a very small number of people who made me feel as though the length of that time was not a weight but an inheritance, something I was carrying forward to the moment when I would need what I had collected. She was very still. I believe, he said, that you are one of those moments. She was 26 years old, and she had lived a life that had given her extensive experience with the weight of feeling things carefully and the necessity of not saying them too fast. She looked at Sorin Mordaine, who was ancient and complicated and extraordinary, and who was looking at her as though she had handed him something he had stopped expecting to receive. And she said, I believe you are one of those moments for me too. He reached out and touched her face. Just the edge of his fingers, cool and careful, tracing the line of her jaw with a precision that was also a kind of reverence. I have never wanted anything across this particular distance before, he said. The distance between human and vampire, she said. The distance between what I am and what would be safe for you, he said, and the honesty of it, the fact that he named the danger as his own nature, made something in her chest move. I am not very interested in safe, she said. I have never been especially. I know, he said. That is part of what I am telling you. She put her hand over his, the one against her face, and held it there. He did not move, neither did she. They stood in the library with centuries of documents around them, and the weight of 3 years, and one catastrophic vessel, and a court full of ancient politics, and it was the most natural thing she had ever done. He pressed his forehead to hers, and she could feel the cool solidity of him, and she closed her eyes. The formal trial of Cassius Vale under blood law was one of the most significant events the Mordaine court had witnessed in a century, and it was witnessed by every court member currently in residence, plus representatives from 4 allied courts, who had been summoned as formal observers under the code. The charges were extensive. The documentation was thorough. Juliette had spent 4 days helping prepare it. She sat in the gallery during the trial, not at the table. She was not a court member and did not have a formal role in the proceedings. She sat in the human observers section, which was a small, raised area at the back of the grand obsidian hall that was technically a concession to the human staff who occasionally needed to witness formal proceedings. No one had ever actually sat in it before, as far as she could tell. The cushions were old. She watched Sorin preside. She watched him conduct the trial with the same quality of controlled, comprehensive authority that she had watched him employ that first night, when he had walked out of the sealed rooms and systematically dismantled everything Cassius had built. He was extraordinary at this, at the formal architecture of the blood law and the old world code, at the use of specific language that carried the full weight of centuries of precedent. He was precise and he was fair, which was not what Cassius deserved, but was what the code required, and he honored the code regardless. Cassius was sentenced to exile, not execution, because the specific violations, serious as they were, did not meet the blood law threshold for execution under the Mordaine code, and Sorin was not willing to lower that threshold for convenience. Exile was permanent, binding, and enforceable by blood law, which meant that any vampire who sheltered or assisted that courtier thereafter was in violation themselves. When the sentence was pronounced, Cassius looked at Juliette across the room. She met his gaze and did not look away. He was escorted out before she did. Ruxan and Mira received lesser sentences appropriate to their lesser roles. The outside party that Cassius had been working with, which turned out to be a rival court operating in the Western Territory, received a formal severing notice under the Intercourt Code, which had consequences that Juliette was still learning about. When it was over, the grand obsidian hall erupted in sound, the controlled and elegant sound of an ancient court releasing several years of accumulated tension. Voices and movement, and the particular quality of vampiric social interaction resuming after a long disruption, Sorin did not immediately move from the presiding position. He looked across the hall to the gallery. He found her. He held her gaze for longer than 3 seconds this time. She smiled at him. It was a very small smile, but she meant all of it. The weeks that followed were different. Not easy, exactly. Rebuilding a court that had been mismanaged for 3 years was complicated work. There were financial arrangements to untangle, alliances to re-examine, court members whose loyalty was uncertain, and who required careful assessment. There were meetings with representatives of the Allied courts and the delicate question of the Western Territory rival court, and the ongoing matter of the blood law amendments that Cassius had pushed through, some of which had to be reversed and some of which were, on examination, not actually bad laws. But the quality of the work was different. It was purposeful and forward-moving, rather than shadowed and waiting. The court that Sorin ran was not the same court that Cassius had managed, and the difference was apparent to everyone in it. Juliette continued to serve at the formal dinners. She had not changed her role in the court, because changing it required a formal process that neither she nor Sorin had yet addressed, and partly because she found the work satisfying, and did not feel any urgency to stop doing it on someone else's schedule. She carried trays with the same efficient grace she always had. She kept her eyes open and noticed things. The difference now was that she also went to the library every night after her shift, and the conversations there had changed quality in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to mistake. He brought her things. Books, not as gifts exactly, but as inclusions. Things he had encountered in his own reading that made him think of something she had said, placed on the table near where she sat without ceremony or explanation. She read them and they talked about them. She brought him things in return. Information and observations, moments from the upper world that she thought would interest him. Small news of the city above ground that filtered down through the human staff and that he could not easily access himself. The gift exchange of curious minds, she thought. She had never had it with anyone before at this scale. The night he kissed her was also the night she told him the part she had been holding back. She had been holding it back not because she was afraid of it, but because she had wanted to be sure. And she had needed to be sure without the pressure of his attention on the question, because his attention had a weight to it that made thinking carefully more difficult than usual. She was sure, now. They were at the library table, side by side rather than across from each other, because they had drifted into that configuration over the preceding weeks without discussing it. She had a document in her hands. He had a document in his. They had been talking about something, and then they had stopped talking, and they had been sitting in silence for a while, the comfortable kind. She put down her document and turned toward him and said, "I need to tell you something," said. He put down his document. He turned toward her. He waited. "I have been afraid of one thing," she said. "Not of you, not of the court or the danger. Of one thing specifically." Tell me," he said. "I am human," she said, "and you are not, and I am not made uncertain by that. I want to be clear. I have had a lot of time to think about it, and I am not uncertain about it. But I am aware that it means there is a gap in how long we would have, if we had anything, and I am aware that this is the part where the honest thing to say is that it frightens me a little." She looked at him. He was looking at her with complete attention. "Not enough to change my mind," she said. "I want you to know that. Not enough to change my mind." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense again of very precise ancient machinery engaging. "There are things I should tell you about that," he said. "Things within the Mordaine blood law that I have not mentioned because they are not simple, and I did not want to use them as a persuasion before you had fully decided." She looked at him carefully. "Tell me now," she said. "There is a provision," he said, "in the most ancient layer of the Mordaine Code. It is not widely known, even within the court. It applies specifically to the lord of a Mordaine court and to a person, human or otherwise, who the lord formally designates as a companion of consequence. It allows, under very specific conditions and with full consent on all sides, a form of the Mordaine bond that has the effect of extending human life significantly." She was very still. "How significantly?" "Centuries," he said. "Not indefinitely, not immortality." "But centuries, you have been sitting on this," she said. "I have been sitting on this," he confirmed. "Because I did not want you to choose me for the provision rather than for me." She stared at him. Then she reached out and took his face in both her hands, which was possibly the most impertinent thing she had ever done to a vampire lord, and she looked at him with absolute clarity. "Sorin Mordaine," she said, "I am not the kind of person who makes choices for any reason other than the reason I have actually decided on. And I decided on you before I had any reason to think the gap was solvable. So do not sit with that concern anymore." He looked at her from inside her hands. His expression had moved into something she was finally beginning to have a name for, though the name was a large and complicated one. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I know," she said. "So are you. Now stop holding back the things you mean to say." He kissed her. It was gentle in a way she had not expected gentle from him. Given everything she knew about his nature and his history and his power, it was careful in the way that someone is careful with something they value enormously and intend to keep. It was also, underneath the gentleness, full of the quality she had been sensing in him from the beginning, the ancient and burning and deeply present attention that was the most consistent thing about him. She kissed him back with everything she had decided, which was everything. When they stopped, she leaned her forehead against his, the way she had in this room before, and she breathed him in, and he held her with the steadiness that was his most fundamental quality. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." The formal designation, companion of consequence. Is that something that has to be done in a specific way? Before the full court, he said. With witnesses, it is a formal ceremony, part of the blood law tradition. It cannot be compelled or coerced, and both parties state their consent explicitly. When does it need to happen? Whenever we decide, then we will decide, she said. When it feels right. Agreed, he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she now had a name for, the one she was going to spend a very long time learning every aspect of. For now, she said. Tell me what else is in the most ancient layer of the code. I suspect there are interesting things in there. He almost smiled, and then he did smile, actually, and completely. And it was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it was, she thought, one of the finest things she had ever seen in her life. There are extraordinary things in there, he said. Good, she said. Start from the beginning. He started from the beginning, 2 months later. On a night chosen for the particular alignment of the court calendar, the designation ceremony was held in the grand obsidian hall, the same hall where she had knelt on the floor beside a broken vessel and taken the hand of a vampire lord. The same hall where 100 ancient eyes had fixed on her and found her wanting. The court was full. All of them were there. The old ones who had been waiting, and the newer ones who were still deciding, and the representatives of the allied courts who had been invited as witnesses, and every human staff member of Mordaine Court who wished to attend, which was all of them. Because word of what Juliette Marwood had done, and what she was to the lord of the court, had travelled with the speed of impossible gossip through every level of the building. She wore the same uniform she always wore to formal court occasions. She had considered changing this and then decided against it, because she was who she was, and starting from anywhere other than that seemed wrong. She walked through the hall alone. No escort, no ceremony of approach. Just Juliette Marwood, walking the length of the grand obsidian hall with her chin up and her eyes clear past the tables and the ancient faces and the blue fire in the great fireplace, toward the place where Sorin Mordaine stood waiting. He was dressed in the formal court attire that she had only seen him wear twice before, dark and precise, and carrying the full weight of the Mordaine tradition, and he watched her walk the entire length of the hall without looking at anything else. She came to stand before him. The hall was silent. Juliette Marwood, he said in the formal language of the ceremony. Before this court, and under blood law, I name you companion of consequence to the Lord of Mordaine Court. This designation is offered freely, without compulsion, and with full acknowledgement of what it means under the ancient code. His eyes were red and warm and entirely her. I ask, in full sight of this court, whether you receive this designation of your own will. She had rehearsed nothing. She had decided that if she rehearsed it, it would not be real in the way she wanted it to be real. I receive it, she said clearly, so that everyone in the room could hear her, of my own will, with full knowledge of what it means and with the intention of keeping it for as long as I live. The hall made that sound again, the one she had heard on the first night. But it was different now. It had shed everything that had made it threatening. What was left was something older and more fundamental. The sound of a court acknowledging that something had become true in their presence. Sorin held out his hand. She took it as she had taken it on the first night, but not the same way. Not the way of someone accepting help from the floor. The way of someone who knew exactly what they were choosing. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, formal and precise, and full of something that the ceremony was only barely containing. "Welcome," he said, quietly enough that it was just for her, "to what is also yours." She looked at him. "I think," she said, at the same volume, "that I have been working here for 3 years." "You have," he said. "But it is different now." "Yes," she said, "it is." The celebration that followed was unlike anything the court had produced in the years she had worked there. Not because it was loud or excessive, because it had the quality that 3 years of stolen stewardship had stripped away, and that Sorin's return had been slowly restoring. The quality of genuine life in a place full of people who had been around long enough to know how rare genuine life was. She danced, eventually, because there was music and because she wanted to. He danced with her, which she had not expected, and he was extraordinary at it in the way that someone was extraordinary at things they had had a very long time to practice. "Did you dance before?" she asked, somewhere in the middle of something slow and stately. "Centuries ago," he said. "I had rather given it up." "What changed?" she said. He looked at her. She already knew the answers. She had asked it to hear what he would say. "Someone broke an enchantment," he said. She laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded. And it echoed in the high-vaulted ceiling of the grand obsidian hall, and the sound of it seemed to surprise even her a little, because she was not certain she had laughed quite like that in any space before that felt this simultaneously dangerous and safe. He was smiling again. The full one. She was already learning that it appeared more easily than it had at first, that she had some influence over its frequency, and that this was one of the finest privileges she had ever been given. She settled closer to him. He held her with the same steadiness that was his fundamental quality. Outside, the city continued above them, its ordinary noise and ordinary light and ordinary human concerns layered over the deep rooms where something extraordinary was happening, where centuries of blood law and ancient codes and political complexity had combined with one woman's particular brand of courage and one lord's particular brand of honor to produce something neither of them had planned for, and both of them intended to keep. The months that followed made the court into something it had not been in a long time. Productive in the deep sense. The financial arrangements were untangled. The Western Territory situation was resolved through a formal inter-court negotiation that produced a treaty both sides could honor. The blood law amendments were reviewed, and the good ones retained, and the bad ones properly repealed. The court members who had been uncertain gradually ceased to be uncertain, because the evidence of what Sorin's leadership produced was visible and accumulating, and because the woman beside him was not the creature they had expected, but someone who was, despite herself, becoming a figure of significance in their world. She had not tried to become a figure of significance. She had simply continued being herself, which was someone who noticed things and remembered them, and acted on what she saw rather than what would be convenient. The court, which had spent 3 years under a kind of leadership that valued compliance, found this novel, and eventually found it admirable, even the ones who would never quite forgive her for being human. The designation had brought her the benefits of the provision in the ancient code, which manifested slowly and not dramatically. She felt it less as a sudden change and more as a deepening of something, a quality of groundedness and resilience and endurance that had always been there becoming more fundamental. The court's physician, a vampire of precise and scientific temperament named Aldrich, who had been at Mordaine Court for 400 years, and had seen 2 other such provisions take effect, told her it would continue to develop over the next several years. She went back to the library and told Sorin what Aldrich had said, because she told it most things. "Are you satisfied with it?" he asked. He asked this in the same way he asked everything important, directly and without flexion. "Yes," she said. "I am satisfied. Aldrich is certain about the timeline." "He is rarely uncertain about anything," Sorin said. "It can make him difficult at court dinners." She laughed. He smiled. They sat across from each other at the library table, the same way they had sat when she had first come to help him rebuild his record of 3 years, but the table between them was not a distance anymore. It was a shared space. She had a book in front of her. He had a document. They worked in comfortable parallel. Outside the library, the court went about its ancient and complicated life, Above them, far above through bedrock and concrete and the ordinary world, the city continued in its ordinary way. Inside the library, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. She looked up from her book and found him watching her. He did this sometimes. She had learned not to deflect it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am glad you are here." "I have been here for 3 years," she said. "I know," he said. "I am particularly glad about the last several months of that." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held it. "I am glad too," she said. Outside the sealed doors that were no longer sealed, past the blue fire and the ancient portrait gallery and the long marble floor, the grand obsidian hall stood empty and quiet in the hours before dawn. The light of the enchanted lanterns fell on the floor, where she had once knelt amid broken glass, where she had once looked up at something extraordinary and reached for the hand it offered, and the floor showed no evidence of any of it except that it was clean and whole, and part of something that was, at last, entirely itself again. The ancient court breathed, the enchantment was broken, and what had grown up from its ruins was not chaos, as Cassius had feared, but something older than ambition and more durable than politics. Something that had needed exactly the particular combination of courage and patience, and a woman who noticed things, and a man who had been waiting for something worth returning to. The story of the human waitress who had broken the enchantment was already becoming the kind of story that got folded into the deep record of the Mordaine court, the kind that would be referenced in formal proceedings and informal memory for centuries. Future members of the court would know her name and what she had done, and would form opinions about her accordingly. She had been told this by Aldrich, who had an archival temperament to complement his medical one. "And what do they say about the waitress?" she had asked. Aldrich had considered. "That she was unexpectedly formidable," he had said, which was high praise from a vampire of his age and disposition. She had thanked him and gone back to work. She was always going back to work. She was always noticing something, recording something, bringing it to the library table and turning it over with the one person whose mind worked in a register that matched hers at full frequency. The court had given her a role that was not called waitress anymore, though she still served at formal occasions when she chose to, because she found she was attached to the directness of it. The role was something closer to advisor, or chief observer, or the person who saw what the Lord needed to see and made sure he saw it. There was no official title for it in the blood law, though Aldrich had suggested several from historical precedent. She was working on the right word. Sorin, when asked, said that she was Juliette Marwood, and that this was already a complete description. She had told him that was the most absurd thing she had ever heard. And he had looked at her with the warm red of his eyes and the full smile that was her particular and entirely unexpected inheritance. And she had thought, not for the first time, that he was correct, and that the name she had always carried had turned out to be the most important thing about her. That, and the angle of Urfel, and 3 years of watching, and the kind of courage that is not absence of fear but the decision, made at 16 and honored ever since, to refuse to let fear be the thing that ran the story. She had not run the story she had expected to run. She had run better in the deep rooms beneath the city. In the library that held centuries of Mordaine history, Juliette Marwood sat with Sorin Mordaine and read and talked and laughed, and the ancient court went on around them, alive and purposeful, and the doors that had been sealed were open, and what was behind them had turned out, in the end, to be worth every risk and every broken thing and every moment of kneeling on a marble floor with glass around her and deciding in a fraction of a second which way to fall. She would choose it all again. She knew this with the same clarity with which she knew everything that mattered, and she held it without ceremony, just as a truth that lived in her chest alongside everything else that was certain. The court breathed. The library was lit with cool, enchanted light. He turned a page, she turned a page. Their hands were still touching across the table. Outside, above, the city went about its ordinary morning, unknowing and indifferent. Below, in the deep and beautiful dark, everything was exactly as it should be at last.